So this paper is called The Supply Side Effects of Monetary Policy. It's joint work with the late Emmanuel Fari, who very tragically passed away last year. I still can't believe it when I say that. And his loss has really been momentous for everybody who knew him professionally, intellectually, personally. I think it's affected a lot of us. And this paper, even though like we wrote it after his passing, you know, it wouldn't exist without him. So anything you like in this paper, you can give credit to Emmanuel. Anything you don't like, you can put the blame on me and Kunal Sangani, who's the other co-author of this paper. Kunal is a fantastic PhD student at Harvard, who's actually just started his second year. So I think I'm sure you're going to hear his name in the future as well. Okay, excellent. So in this paper, as you might be able to guess from the title, the big picture question that we are asking is, do aggregate demand shocks affect the aggregate productivity of an economy? Now, I think it's safe to say that the common sort of quote unquote mainstream answer to this question is no. The sort of received wisdom is that the sort of aggregate demand shocks that are hitting the economy are orthogonal to an economy's aggregate productivity, because the aggregate productivity of the economy is determined by the technology that we have. And the technology has sort of nothing to do with things that are moving aggregate demand. Now, if you take this view, which is baked into a lot of the sort of standard models, then there's sort of an awkward fact that you have to explain in the data, which is that in the data, measures of aggregate productivity seem like they're very pro-cyclical, and they seem like they respond to monetary disturbances. So for example, the solo residual is pro-cyclical and responds to money shocks, and it responds to fiscal policy. Labor productivity in the same way is pro-cyclical and responds to things that seem like they have nothing to do with technology. And so the classic answer to this observation in the data, that these aggregate productivity objects seem like they're responding to non-technology related shocks, is that the objects in the data are mismeasured. So the idea is that because we don't understand how to measure input usage, let's say we don't account for capacity utilization, that's causing an observation that productivity looks like it responds to aggregate demand, even though it's really not doing it. In this paper, we take a different approach, and we say, actually, if you write down a model with realistic ingredients, in particular, if you have the kind of realistic firm-level heterogeneity that we think exists in the real world, then it is very natural for aggregate productivity to respond to aggregate demand shocks. And the pro-cyclicality you see in the data is very easy to explain with a standard model that doesn't, and you don't need to rely on anything about mismeasurement. And so that's sort of the big picture goal in the paper. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to build a model with, as I say, realistic firm-level heterogeneity. And by realistic firm-level heterogeneity, what I really am talking about is more realism in terms of the way firms set their markups, both in the cross-section of firms and in the time series of firms. And then this is going to result in monetary policy, or I think other kinds of demand shocks, having effects on aggregate productivity that are quite pronounced. So what are the ingredients that we need? Well, in the standard model, and when I say the standard model, I want you to think of, for example, Ghali's textbook. The assumption is that firms face a constant price elasticity of demand. So usually the way that monopolistic competition is modeled is you say there's some CES aggregator, so everybody has the same price elasticity of demand. What this implies is that desired firm level markups are identical. Every firm, regardless of how big they are, wants to charge the same markup in steady state. The other thing it means is that the responses of firms to shocks to their marginal cost is also identical. Because every firm wants to charge the same markup, that means every firm also wants to pass any changes in cost onto their price one for one, so that their markup doesn't change. And so this is sometimes called complete pass-through, complete desired pass-through. And these are both features of sort of the standard model. But of course, both of these features are really at odds with the data. In the data, what we see is that firms look like in the cross-section, they have very, very different desired markups. There's a lot of dispersion in firm-level markups. And furthermore, so typically, people think that the small firms want to charge lower markups than the larger firms, because as firms get bigger, their demand curves become less elastic. Furthermore, there's also a lot of evidence that firms with high markups have the ability to absorb cost shocks into their markup. So if you're a firm that's charging a high markup and you get an increase in your costs, in the data, what we tend to see is that those increases in cost don't get transmitted into the price one for one. Instead, firms adjust their markups. They eat some of the cost into their margins, and so their price rises by less. And this is called incomplete pass-through. And both of these are things that are sort of missing from the standard model, and that's what we're going to put into our model. So one way you can think of this paper is it sort of gives you a tractable way to integrate firm differences into the new Keynesian model. And then what you gain by doing this is you get lots of rich predictions for the transmission of demand shocks, which now are going to start going through productivity. So we're going to propose a new misallocation channel for monetary policy. What we're going to show is that changes in allocative efficiency can arise from a change in interest rates or a change in the stock of money supply. And these changes in allocative efficiency have to do with the fact that firms have dispersed markups in steady state, and they have variable pass-through of cost into their price every time the marginal costs change. What this is going to result in is every time you do a monetary easing, that's going to raise aggregate productivity. And it's going to be as if there was an endogenous positive supply shock. I mean, I'm saying as if it is an endogenous positive supply shock because resources are being used more efficiently in the economy. What this means, though, is because there's this positive endogenous supply shock that comes with the demand shock, that means Phillips curves are going to be flatter. And because Phillips curves are flatter, that basically is one way to say monetary policy is more powerful than in a model that doesn't have this ingredient. Furthermore, the slope of the Phillips curve is now going to be tied down to things that have to do with industrial organization, like industrial concentration, average markups, average pass-throughs, things of that nature. And so they can respond. It can change if industrial concentration, for example, changes. But the outcome is going to be aggregate TFE is going to fall in recessions without any change in technology. And firm-level TFPR dispersion is going to be counter-cyclical. So dispersion in firm-level TFPR will rise in recessions and fall in booms, which is something people have observed in the data. But it's going to have nothing to do with uncertainty shocks, which is one way people interpret changes in TFPR dispersion. Great. Any questions so far? Okay. So the results I'm going to show you, they're going to apply sort of, I think, in most frameworks that have variable markups and pass-throughs that vary in a similar way. In particular, you could do all of what I'm about to show you using an oligopolistic competition model, a la Atkinson-Bernstein. Or you could do it with monopolistic competition, a la like Kimball. The important thing is you have to deviate from CES. CES is a non-starter. Like the monopolistic competition under CES is a non-starter. But as soon as you deviate away from that, you're going to start to see effects like this. In the paper today, I'm going to focus on monopolistic competition as the modeling device rather than oligopoly. But in the appendix of the paper, we also do a calibration with oligopoly, and we find very similar numbers. And I can tell you why monopolistic competition may be preferable for some technical reasons. It just ends up being more tractable to do monopolistic competition. which is sort of the main reason I think I prefer it. So the advantages of going monopolistic competition, you get simple closed form formulas for what determines the slope of the Phillips curve. But more important than that is you get very tractable dynamic equations. So in particular, we're going to produce a 4-equation New Keynesian model to be contrasted with the classic workhorse 3-equation model. And the 4th equation is an equation that tells you how aggregate TFP changes in response to shocks. But other than that, it's a very simple model. You can plug it into Dynaire and simulate it. And then the other thing that the monopolistic competition approach allows us to do is we can do some non-parametric estimation when it comes to thinking about how to map the model to the data, which is, I think, useful. Great. So, excuse me. So what are the model elements? As I mentioned, we're going to have monopolistic competition, but the key is going to be that we're going to deviate from CES. We're going to do it via Kimball preferences, which is a generalization of CES. And then we're going to have heterogeneity. So we're going to have heterogeneity in the productivity of the firms in the economy. So their marginal costs of these firms is going to vary. But we're also going to have heterogeneity in terms of desired markups and desired pass-throughs. And this is because we've moved away from CES. And then on top of this, we are going to put in Calvo frictions. And that's going to be the nominal rigidity. So the paper is related to really very large literature. So here's like a selection of papers that this paper relates to. We're related to a literature that is documented that measures of productivity are sensitive to changes in what you would think of as aggregate demand shocks. And we're also related to a literature that has emphasized the role of misallocation in the economy, particularly at business cycle frequencies. So really the mechanism in this paper is going to be changes in misallocation in response to monetary policy. That's what's driving changes in productivity in our model. The other literatures that this paper is related to is the literature on the cross-sectional differences and how firms respond to shocks. Small firms and large firms look like they don't respond in quite the same way. And finally, there's sort of a nascent literature about how industrial organization interacts with monetary policy, which is also something that this paper relates to. Okay, excellent. So here's the agenda.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So this is Federico Neus from the Central Bank. So you've sort of loaded the misallocation on imperfect competition. But I guess the other natural misallocation that is relevant for monetary policy is financial frictions. Do you have anything? I know you don't have it in the paper, but do you have anything to say about how that would sort of change the predictions if you have the included?
So that's a good question. I think you could imagine that there would be very similar effects there, in the sense that I would expect it to probably strengthen the results at some basic level, in the following sense. If you think that in the cross section, what's going on is that there's some firms who are more constrained than the rest in terms of their ability to access financing. And if those constraints are weakened during a boom, when the central bank decides to ease monetary policy, then that would, I would imagine, that would result in a reallocation from guys who were very financially constrained, from guys who were not financially constrained towards the guys who are more financially constrained. And if you have a mechanism like that in the model, it's gonna also cause an increase in aggregate productivity. But that's not, but this is going to be a different mechanism. Now, whether or not the two mechanisms are going to interact with each other, I think they would if you thought that there was some kind of covariance between them, I think, like between the financial wedges and the markup wedges, which is possible. But that's not something I'm going to rely on here. I think the point here is, like, you know, this is going to be a very kind of, in some sense, it's going to be a very standard model, you know. I'm not going to put in anything exotic, basically. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the basic New Keynesian model and then just generalize that model to the point where it's able to match the data. Which is to say, generalize it to the point where it's able to match the fact that we measure incomplete pass-through and dispersed markups, desired markups. And once you do that, these forces emerge very naturally. But I mean, this is not a paper, I think, where we try to say, it's not sort of a quantitative paper is one way to say it. You know, it's not a paper where we say, we're going to put in all the ingredients that we think are realistic, and here's how much it matters. It's more just to say that there is this hidden mechanism in the traditional framework with the traditional frictions that people have been missing, and it can be quite powerful.
Yeah, I guess the doubt was like, how robust is the message to the source of the misallocation that you have in the model?
So I think it's fair, you know, whenever somebody writes a paper which is has some friction in it, you can always say, could I put in some extra friction that would like kill the effect, I guess. And I think that's, I mean, as a matter of theory, I'm sure you could, but I don't see any reason why you would expect it to necessarily, yeah, I don't see any reason why the two things would interact, really. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that, yeah, you know, I think that would be an interesting area to keep going, basically. Because I think what we're sort of trying to say here is, once you start thinking about the fact that the cross-sectional distribution of resources is inefficient in the initial equilibrium, then there's the possibility that monetary policy has very powerful effects on productivity. So that's the first point, which is a very generic point. And then that means that you have to start thinking very hard about what the initial distortions are. And the initial distortions that we have here are going to be just monopolistic competition. That's it. But you're right that if you then supplemented this with additional distortions like financial frictions, that's probably going to result in something different, which I think is also worth studying. But I guess this is like one step at a time, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question, David?
Sure.
This is Ernesto Pasten from the Central Bank of Chile. If you take the Baqaae textbook model and deviate from zero trade inflation, you naturally are going to get that there is some sort of misallocation coming from price dispersion. I wonder in which extent the mechanism here is one way to get price dispersion, but after that is capture the price dispersion becomes a sufficient statistic of any sort of this origin, this source of the misallocation, or the standard one coming from the price rigidity?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'm going to come back, if it's possible, I'm going to come back to that. The point is that you won't get these effects in the traditional Baqaae model, even if you do it around a steady state with initial dispersion. So, but it actually also relates to what Federico is asking. So if you give me like a few slides, I'm going to come back to this by way of an example. So thanks a lot. Okay, if there's no other questions, great. So here's sort of the agenda today. So I'm going to start off by setting up a very simple model. So it's going to be like a two-period, one step ahead Calvo type model. Just a very simple model that we can solve all the way down by pen and paper to get the main intuition of what the mechanism is. And then once we've done that, then I'm going to show you sort of what the dynamic model looks like, which is sort of the more traditional New Keynesian type of model with an infinite horizon. And then at the end, then we'll try to calibrate the relevant sufficient statistics and see quantitatively how much does this matter. But as I say, it's a quantitative illustration. This is not a big, like, quantitatively realistic model. We're only going to put in the ingredients that we need for our mechanism. We're not going to put in all the other ingredients that people think are required in order for you to have a quantitatively realistic model. Okay, excellent. So what's the setup? So here's what the sort of simple static model looks like. You start at some initial equilibrium, let's call it T0, where firms are maximizing, households are maximizing, markets are clearing. Then between T0 and T1, there is a nominal shock. So the monetary authority changes some nominal price. In our case, we're going to focus on a change in the nominal wage, which is the marginal cost that the firms face. So the nominal wage changes, and then a new equilibrium is established. But this time, the flex price firms get to readjust their prices, which is some randomly chosen subset of firms. And then all the other firms, they just have to keep their nominal price constant at what it was at T0. And then the households adjust and markets clear. So it's a very simple version of a Cowper model. So there's households and there's firms. And so I have to tell you what optimization problem each of them is facing. So the households are, there's a unit mass of them and they're identical. So there's a representative household, and the representative household is maximizing consumption minus the disutility, utility from consumption minus the disutility from working. So consumption is big Y and labor is big L. And so zeta, for example, here is the Frisch elasticity of labor supply. Now, the key thing is going to be in the standard model, big Y is a CES aggregate of different varieties of goods. In this model, big Y is not going to be a CES aggregate. It's going to be determined implicitly by this equation here, which is called sort of Kimball preferences after Mons Kimball's 1995 paper. So this upsilon function is going to be key. It's going to be what we're going to call the Kimball aggregator. Okay, so what is this equation telling you? So imagine that upsilon is a power function. So like it's just, you raise everything to some power. If upsilon is a power function, then you can take big Y outside of the integral, put it on the other side, and then it becomes CES preferences. So this is a generalization of CES preferences. Whenever upsilon is a power function, whenever upsilon is isoelastic, it's a special it becomes CES. But it allows you to move away from CES in a very nice way that I'm going to clarify in a second. But these are well-defined homothetic preferences, even though we don't have a closed form way of representing them. This is totally legit. And then given this utility function, the household is going to maximize utility subject to their budget constraint, which says you have to pay for your consumption expenditures using labor income and profit income that you get from the firms. Now, what's useful about these Kimball preferences is if you solve for the demand curve for every variety, you see that it has a very nice form, which basically says that the relative quantity of variety omega is a decreasing function of the relative price. Okay? And this upsilon prime, which is the derivative of the Kimball aggregator, is giving you the shape of the demand curve. And so what's nice about Kimball preferences is by picking upsilon, you can have your demand curve have whatever shape you want it to. Notice that if upsilon was a power function, this would be CES preferences. But in general, we're going to be able to deviate from that. So that's the household side. What about the firm side? The firms are going to be indexed from 0 to 1. And I want you to think of 0 as being the least productive firm in the economy, and 1 as the most productive firm in the economy. So they're sort of indexed by how productive they are. Every variety is produced by a single producer subject to this Cavill friction, and with probability 1 minus delta, you set your price before observing the nominal shock, and with probability delta, you get to reset your price. So notice that we're going to allow delta to vary as a function of firm type. We don't have to do that, but we're just going to do it so we can see how that's going to affect the results. And finally, production is linear in labor with a marginal cost that's going to be given by the wage divided by the productivity shifter of the firm, which is type dependent. So as I said, high types have high productivity, which means they have lower marginal cost. So firms are going to set their prices to maximize expected profits. And so expected profits is just sales minus costs. subject to this downward sloping residual demand curve. Okay, great. So any questions about any of this so far? Great. Okay, so to think about this model, I'm going to have to define some key sufficient statistics that we have to keep track of. These are sort of traditional things that you're familiar with from Econ 101, you know? We're going to have to keep track of the price elasticity of demand. That's a very important statistic. So I'm going to call it sigma, and I'm going to notice that the price elasticity of demand in this model is going to vary as a function of the size of the firm. So as I said, if this was a CES, this sigma would be constant. But now the sigma is going to start changing depending on how big you are. The nice thing about Kimball preferences is that the price elasticity of demand is just the coefficient of curvature of upsilon. So notice that if upsilon, again, is a power function, this is a constant. But in this model, it's not going to be a constant. It's going to start moving around as a function of the size of the firm. But given that the price elasticity is varying as a function of size, that means markups are going to vary as a function of size. So we're going to define a markup function, which is a function of how big the firm is. And it's just going to be given by 1 over 1 minus 1 over the price elasticity of demand. And this is like the traditional, you know, learner formula for optimal markups. The final statistic that I need to keep track of is the pass-through of marginal cost into the price in partial equilibrium. And this is desired pass-through. So this says, if I change your marginal cost by 1%, by how many percent do you want to change your price? And that's some number, but it's a number that depends on size. And so we're going to call it rho, and we're going to index it by the fact that it's a function of size. Now, in a CES model, this thing is always equal to 1. But in this model, it's not equal to 1. It's going to vary as a function of the firm size. Okay, very good. So I just want to kind of put you in a particular mindset about what you should expect this rho function to look like. Empirically, what we expect this rho function to look like is we expect it to be less than or equal to 1. So pass-throughs in principle could be greater than 1, but that's not what people estimate. And furthermore, we should expect it to decline as a function of firm size. So if you write down an Atkinson-Bernstein style model, this naturally happens in that model. In this model, it doesn't have to happen, but it's something that could happen depending on the shape of the demand curve. So here is like some empirical estimates, just so you have a concrete picture to put in your mind. So here are estimates of the pass-through from Amiti et al. And on the x-axis, we've got the size of the firms. So we're going from the smallest firm to the largest firm. And on the y-axis, we have average pass-throughs for firms up to a given cutoff of the percentile in this firm size distribution. So when you go to 1, this is the average pass-through for all firms in the economy. And you can see on average, it's something like 0.65. It's really not equal to 1, as it would be in a CES model. The other thing you could see is that the bottom, like 80% of firms have a pass-through that's like 97%. So it looks like most firms in the economy have complete pass-through. And then there's some really big guys who have incomplete pass-through. And their incomplete pass-through is quite extreme. And so this is the sort of thing that we would like to put into the model. Okay, so what's the equilibrium notion? As I said, the bank is going to choose the price. Households are going to choose consumption and labor to maximize utility. Firms are going to set prices. And then we're going to see what happens. Okay, good. So the way we're going to think about monetary policy being implemented here is via the nominal wage. Now, why would output move? Well, output could move in response to a change in the nominal wage for 2 reasons in principle. The first reason is there could be a change in employment. This is the traditional demand side effect in New Keynesian models. But in principle, there could also be a change in productivity. And so this is the thing that we're going to be focused on. Now, the first thing we want to notice is if the markups are all the same in the initial equilibrium, then productivity is not going to change to a first order. Okay, and so this comes back now to Ernesto's point, which is in the traditional Baqaae model, if you log linearize around the zero inflation steady state, where everybody wants to charge the same markups, you're not going to see anything. Okay. So now in a second, we're going to see what happens if you log linearize away from the zero inflation steady state. Are you necessarily going to find something or not in the traditional model? And I'm going to sort of get to that soon. But to think about how productivity is going to respond in general, we need to define the sales distribution. So here, lambda theta is the sales share of firms of type theta. So anytime you see an expectation in the rest of the paper or a covariance or something, and I put a subscript lambda, that means it's the sales weighted average or the sales weighted covariance or whatever it is, okay? Great. So how can we think about changes in productivity in this economy? Well, in order to think about changes in productivity, I'm going to define the average markup or the aggregate markup of the economy as the harmonic sales weighted average of markups. Okay, and so mu bar is going to be the average markup. Now, in previous work with Emmanuel, we showed that in general, if you want to think about aggregate productivity, the way you can track movements in aggregate productivity is by comparing the change in the average markup to the average change in the markup. So if you're in an environment where, let's say, the average markup is going up, but markups on average are not going up, that means productivity is increasing. Why is that? Well, notice that if this thing is positive, that's telling you there's a composition effect happening, which is that the high markup firms are expanding. And whenever the high markup firms expand relative to the low markup firms, that's an improvement in productivity. Now, this might be surprising if you're not used to thinking about this stuff a lot, but you have to recognize the fact that the distortion associated with a markup is that the firm is too small. So if something causes the firm that had the high markup to start producing more, that's going to be an improvement in productivity. That's going to be key to the mechanism in the paper. So here is how productivity moves in this model. Okay, so what is the change in productivity when you change marginal cost? There's going to be two forces. The first thing I want you to notice is these kappas, they're just scalars that are both positive. So you don't need to worry about them. The thing that you should focus on are these covariances. The first covariance is a covariance between the price elasticity of demand and the desired pass-through among the flexible firms. If this covariance is positive, aggregate productivity will go up. What's the intuition? The intuition is this is saying that the firms with the high price elasticity are the ones with the high pass-through. That means the ones with the low price elasticity have low pass-throughs, right? Well, what does that mean? That's telling you that the guys who have the really low markups have complete pass-through or close to complete pass-through. The guys with the really low markups, they have very incomplete pass-through. So what happens when monetary policy raises the marginal cost? When marginal cost goes up, the high markup firms cut their markups by more than the low markup firms because they have incomplete pass-through. Because they're cutting their markups, that's going to reallocate resources to them. Because you're reallocating resources away from low markup guys towards high markup guys, that's going to boost aggregate productivity. And this is exactly the empirical thing that we saw in Amiti et al., right? In these estimates, it's the large firms that have the high markups that are the ones with the low pass-throughs. So this is sometimes called Marshall's second law of demand. And under Marshall's second law of demand, this term is positive. Okay? So this is the first mechanism that could be causing an improvement in productivity. It is reallocation due to heterogeneity and desired pass-through. There's actually a second mechanism that could deliver improvements in productivity, which is if the Calvo parameter is correlated with the price elasticity of demand, which is another way to say, if you're in a situation where the high markup firms are exogenously just stickier, like you just assume that the high markup firms have stickier prices than the low markup firms. then you get the same mechanism playing through. And so this is reallocation due to heterogeneity in the price stickiness parameter. Both of these are mechanisms by which realized pass-through. And realized pass-through is a combination of desired pass-through and price stickiness. If realized pass-through co-varies with the initial level of the markup, then you get productivity effects. Now we can come back to Ernesto's question. Ernesto, in the framework you were thinking about, which is Baqaae log linearized away from zero inflation steady state, you are going to have dispersed markups, but there's not going to be any mechanism that's going to give you these covariances. So through a first order, you're still going to see zero because there's no systematic correlation between pass-throughs and the level of the markups, which is something you need in order to get these productivity effects to show up. Okay. So any questions about this before I push on?
So just to be clear about that, you will see that price dispersion generate that first order misallocation effect in that particular model. It won't be tied to markups. I agree with that.
Yeah, well, no. So here's what the claim is. The claim is if you do a monetary policy shock in that kind of model, right? To a first order, TFP is not going to respond. Even though TFP, like in general, reallocations will move TFP to a first order. It's just that the reallocations that are triggered by monetary policy don't reallocate resources systematically between high and low markup firms. And it's not enough that you have distortions in the initial equilibrium. You also need reallocations to be systematic. If you just have random reallocations, even though you have distortions in the initial equilibrium, you don't always improve productivity when you do easing, which is something we have here. The thing you really need here is the systematic reallocation. Okay, and so in deriving these equations, it actually sort of doesn't matter so much where the initial markup came from. Was it because it's the initial desired markup, or is it because there was some past period with price stickiness that resulted in you having dispersed markup? That doesn't matter so much. What really matters is, given the markup you have now, including whatever price stickiness played a role in setting your initial markup, is there a systematic relationship between your markup and the pass-through? And if you have that, then you're going to get the productivity effects. If you don't have that, to a first order at least, you won't get the productivity effects. Okay,
thanks.
Great. One thing I should mention is another implication of this result is that if this thing is positive, if aggregate productivity is increasing when you increase if you do a monetary easing, this means that TFPR dispersion is falling to a first order. So if you look at the dispersion of firm level TFPRs, what you should see is that they should be countercyclical. And that's another thing that people have observed in the data. So this sort of ties some facts about the aggregate productivity to some facts about the distribution of micro productivity as measured by TFPR. Okay, very good. So here's the two different mechanisms. So the first mechanism is, suppose that the Calvo parameter is homogeneous across firms, which is the standard assumption. The standard model says the Calvo parameter doesn't vary by firms. Well, in that case, the only thing that matters is the covariance between desired pass-through and the price elasticity, which is basically the initial markup. So under Marshall's second law, this is going to be positive. Excuse me. The second mechanism is, suppose that you have homogeneous pass-throughs, but you have heterogeneity in the Calvo parameter. Well, in that case, if the covariance is positive, again, you're going to get an improvement in productivity. In this case, you can actually rewrite this covariance as the expectation of the price elasticity of the flex guys minus the expectation of the price elasticity of the sticky guys. And so you could see that if the price elasticity of the flex guys, which are the low markup, if this is higher than this one, then that's saying the low markup guys are more flexible than the high markup guys. That means that you're going to cut the high markups when you raise prices through monetary policy. Okay. Now, this mechanism I'm not going to focus on anymore going forward. So I'm going to shut down. I'm going to shut down heterogeneity in the countable parameter for the most part. What I'm going to be really focused on is heterogeneity in desired pass-throughs, because that's sort of where we have stronger evidence. But it's still. It's nice to point out that there could be another mechanism that could be driving these sorts of results as well. So that's how productivity responds. What about output? How does real GDP respond to changes in monetary policy? So here's the output response. So the response of output, you can break it up into two pieces. One is this supply side effect, which we've characterized so far. And the other is the demand side effect. And the demand side effect here is basically coming through the change in the average markup. Okay, so this is the mechanism in the traditional New Keynesian model. In the traditional New Keynesian model, what happens when you do a monetary easing is that firms have their markups get cut. Because markups get cut, that means that labor demand goes up. Because labor demand goes up, you get a boost in output because employment goes up. And this is that effect. So the first thing you can notice that it has to do with how much markups are getting cut, because that's the amount by which you're going to stimulate labor demand. And it depends on the Frisch elasticity of labor supply. In particular, if the Frisch elasticity is 0, if you have inelastic labor, the demand side effect disappears. Notice that even with a 0 Frisch, the supply side effect is still there, because it has nothing to do with employment. It has to do with productivity. Okay? So what is this demand side effect? This demand side effect has two components. One, so here we've sort of written it out. One component just has to do with sticky prices. So if the prices are really sticky, then the cut in markups is larger. Therefore, you get more of a demand side effect. There's a second mechanism in this paper, which has been greatly emphasized in the literature, which is real rigidities. Real rigidities just says if you have, in this model, what happens is when the sticky guys are forced to cut their markups, the flex guys, they also cut their markups a little bit because of strategic complementarities in pricing. And so that's going to be a mechanism by which the demand side effect is going to be strengthened in the model. But it's really different to the thing we're emphasizing, which is the supply side effect. Notice that these real rigidities, if the pass-through equals 1, like in the CES model, this effect disappears. Okay?
There is one question. So for the supply side effect, in the supply side effect, we are assuming that firms, big, large, and small firms, they have the same productivity, so that you have this elasticity depends on the size of the firms, and so a shock would actually impact firms differently, but the TFP is the same across small and large firms. Is it?
No. So
No?
the thing in the model, the thing that causes the firms to be different sizes in the first place is the fact that they have different TFPs.
I see.
If they all had the same TFP, they would all be the same size.
So it accounts for the fact that the TFP is different and resources are allocated to firms that they have larger TFP because this elasticity adjusts for the size of the firm.
Yeah, so Francesco, the thing you're asking about is like the key intuition in these kinds of models.
I was slightly late, so probably.
Yeah. So thank you for raising this point, okay? And there's nothing I say today that's more important than what I'm about to say right now, which is that in these models, these reallocation effects, they have nothing to do with who is more productive, okay? Like TFPQ is not the important thing. The sufficient statistic is the markup, just in general, right? In general, what you want, if you want to improve productivity, is you want whoever is charging the high markup to get bigger. Because the high markup is the sufficient statistic that tells you on the margin, is this firm getting enough resources or not? TFP measured as some sort of like, is like an average object. It's not a marginal object. So that's why TFPQ, the fact that like resources are going to the high TFPQ firms is actually not the mechanism. It's not important. The thing that's important is that the high TFPQ firms happen to have the high markups. If they happen to have low markups, it would be a bad thing if you gave more resources to high TFPQ firms. It's all about the initial markup. That's why in efficient models, TFP doesn't move to a first order, because you can have as much heterogeneity in TFPQ as you like in an efficient model, but if everyone has the same markup, it doesn't matter if you reallocate resources. I mean, at some level, even comparing TFPQ across firms that are not producing goods that are perfect substitutes is conceptually a very difficult thing to do, right? Like if you make yogurt and I make cars, how are we supposed to compare our TFPQs? We can compare our markups. That's a very sensible object to compare. And if your markup is higher than mine, then you're not getting enough resources. But our TFPQs, which is like units of cars produced per unit of inputs for you and units of yogurt produced per unit of input for me, those are not really meaningful to be compared across the firms.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. That's very clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, so having the dispersed markups is really key here to getting these effects to show up. Okay, great. So this is just sort of like the way we're going to decompose the effect. So we have the demand side effect that goes through labor demand, and then we have the supply side effect that goes through productivity growth. Okay, now given that equation, I could just rewrite this thing so that I have the slope of the Phillips curve. So here's the Phillips curve. The wage Phillips curve has a slope that depends on the demand side effect and the supply side effect. Notice that if the supply side effect is present and positive, so d log A is a positive number, that makes the Phillips curve flatter. This is the wage Phillips curve. And I can do the same thing for the price Phillips curves. And again, the productivity effect shows up in the denominator. So if this is a positive number, the Phillips curve becomes flatter. And so this is that mechanism that I was emphasizing earlier. So now I'm going to do a bunch of different examples just to see what happens. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that we have sort of the Baqaae model. So we're going to say the Kimball preferences are a power function. So this is CES preferences with elasticity of substitution sigma. But we have heterogeneity in productivity. So this goes back to Francesco's question. You have heterogeneous productivity, but you have the CES Kimball aggregate. So what does that imply? Well, because this is isoelastic, the price elasticity of demand is constant for everybody. That means desired markups are constant for everybody, and desired pass-throughs is complete. That means by the envelope theorem that I showed you at the beginning, aggregate productivity doesn't respond to shocks, which means that the slope of the Phillips curve just depends on the Frisch, and it depends on the Calvo parameter. And this is very intuitive. This is the traditional Phillips curve. The higher is price stickiness, the flatter is the Phillips curve. That's it. There's nothing else going on. What happens if we now go to a non-CES model, but we have firms that are homogeneous? So we have Kimball, but all the firms have the same productivity, right? This is the traditional way people do Kimball. The way people typically put Kimball into models with nominal rigidities, like Clino Willis or Miles Kimball's original paper, is they assume away heterogeneity of TFPQ, which is what Francesco was asking about. Well, in that case, we still have that every firm has the same price elasticity of demand because the firms are identical. There's no dispersion in the firm size distribution. That means they all have the same markup, but now they have incomplete pass-through. Notice that aggregate productivity still doesn't respond to a first order. Why? Because there was no dispersion in initial markups. So the way the Phillips curve changes is you just get an extra term, which makes it flatter. And this has to do with incomplete pass-through. So notice it's literally the same expression, except there's a number less than 1 multiplying. This is the real rigidities mechanism. The real rigidities mechanism makes the Phillips curve flatter still. The final thing that we can do is suppose we have heterogeneous firms. We have Kimball, but now I assume pass-throughs are constant. Now, this is a bit along the lines of what Ernesto had in mind. So we have dispersed firm distribution. We have Kimball preferences, but pass-throughs happen to be the same for every firm. There's actually a closed form for what the Kimball aggregator has to be in order for this to happen. If you know about the exponential integral function, that's what the Kimball aggregator is. That's just like a dirty cycle. But if you make the Kimball aggregator be an exponential integral, pass-throughs, desired pass-throughs don't vary in the cross-section of firms. You still have then that productivity doesn't respond to monetary shocks, to a first order, even though markups are dispersed. Why is that? Because if these rows are all the same and the Cavill parameter is all the same, then if I go back to my expression here, both of these covariances are zeros. So you don't get anything, right? So it's really important that you have covariance in the realized pass-throughs with the initial level of the markups. Okay, great. Any questions about any of this? Awesome. And so once we go to like the more general model, you know, you're going to get these extra terms showing up, which are going to make the Phillips curve flatter. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to quantify these in a moment. Before I do that, before we try to quantify the model, I'm just going to briefly kind of walk you through what a dynamic version of this model would look like. Because we only did like a 2-period model so far. So here's how the dynamic model works. We're going to assume that every firm is going to set prices subject to maximize the net present value of profits, sort of discounted profits, subject to a dynamic Cavill friction. And then we're going to assume that the household's intertemporal choices are disciplined via standard Euler equation for consumption. And then the central bank policy, we have some freedom here on how to do it. We can do it with a money growth rule and some money demand function. Or we can have them implement monetary policy with an interest rate rule, like a Taylor rule for nominal interest rates. So I'm going to show you the equations for the Taylor rule, but you could do the other one just as easily, sort of nothing to it. And as I said, I'm going to focus on the case where the Cavill parameter is not heterogeneous across the firm size distribution. So all the action is going to come from desired pass-throughs, not from price stickiness. So here is the dynamic model. Here's the so-called 4-equation New Keynesian model. So 2 of the equations are identical to what we had before, so I don't need to spend any time on them. The first one is the Taylor rule. Obviously, that's just going to be the same as what you find in Ghali's textbook. Excuse me. The second equation is the Euler equation, or the dynamic IS equation, which is also just the usual one. The 2 equations that are a bit different is going to be the new Phillips curve, the New Keynesian Phillips curve, which now is different, and this endogenous TFT equation that I mentioned briefly, which is absent from the 3-equation model. So how is the Phillips curve different? The Phillips curve is different in 2 ways. The first one is it has a flatter slope. And this has to do with the fact that you have incomplete pass-through, right? So this is the average sales weighted pass-through. In the CES model, this would be 1, but in this model, it's a number less than 1. And so you're making the Phillips curve flatter. But more interestingly, what you have is you have a new disturbance term in the New Keynesian Phillips curve, which is aggregate productivity. And it sort of shows up like a cost push shock would. And the key thing is this aggregate productivity object has its own dynamic equation that determines how it's evolving over time. And it's a second-order difference equation, which depends on covariance between pass-throughs and markups or price elasticities. And so if this covariance is positive, it's sort of going to result in movements in aggregate productivity. Every time output moves, aggregate productivity moves, and then you're going to get this additional force inside the model that's going to amplify and make things more persistent. As like, again, as a nerdy point, side point, notice that these equations are all first-order difference equations. This one's a second-order difference equation. So it's sort of going to be a mechanism that can generate hump-shaped responses even when you have interest rate shocks, which is sort of, I mean, it's sort of interesting to point out. Now, the thing that's nice about this equation is like, you know, you can just put this in Dynaire and simulate it without having to do very much. It's just one extra equation in your Dynaire code. The thing that's sort of interesting here, though, is the natural question that's going to come up is what information do you need in order to calibrate this kind of model, right? So I've hidden some things here with this like kappa A. It's hiding, it's some combination of the primitives, some sufficient statistics of the underlying model. And also the same with alpha. And so the question would be, how can I actually quantify this object? And so that's where we're going to go now. We're going to think about how you would quantify this.
May I ask you a quick clarification question, David?
Sure.
Ernesto here. I think that here the steady state is not affected by monetary policy. So this is the regular thing that monetary policy is going to have a short run effect, but not long run effects, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
that's it.
Okay, excellent. So
Can
let's
I
try
ask
to
you-
think. Sure.
Can I ask you another question? So here, is it the case that also the state of the economy matters? So the distribution of firms, whether they are large or small, it will matter, right, for the dynamics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Even in the static model, that's going to matter, right? So that's one of the things that I'm going to show you briefly if we have time at the end, which is now the slope of the Phillips curve is a function of like industrial concentration. So when
Exactly.
size distribution changes, the Phillips curve becomes flatter. So I'm going to show you that.
I may have to rush, but so if you don't see me, it's not because I felt I need to pick up my daughter, but I'll stay until I can.
Okay, sounds good. So all of this is in the paper. So if you're interested in these quantitative exercises, you can take a look at that if you have to leave soon. So okay, so how do we calibrate this model? So there's some sufficient statistics you need. So obviously you're going to need all the parameters that you need when you calibrate the standard workhorse model. So you need the Frisch, you need the whatever, the discount factor, the Calvo parameter, etc., etc. You need the IES, you need all of that. But on top of the usual sufficient statistics, there's 4 other parameters that you need to know in order to calibrate the model. These are the average pass-through, the average markup, the average price elasticity of demand, and then finally the covariance of pass-throughs and price elasticities. So, this one you probably have some ideas about. And in the CES model, you know exactly what this one is because it's sort of tied to this. This one in the CES model is 1, and this one is 0. But in general, those aren't the case, and so that's what the general model behaves like. Now, if you happen to have some idea about what these numbers are, you could just plug them in and see what happens. The way we're going to calibrate these numbers is we're going to rely on the estimates by Amiti et al. That I showed you at the beginning. So Amiti et al. Produced estimates of the pass-through function as a function of firm size. What we're going to do is we're going to back out the Kimball aggregator that rationalizes that shape non-parametrically. So we're going to say, what Kimball aggregator do you need in order to exactly match the pass-through function that Amiti et al. Estimated? And then once you know the Kimball aggregator, then you can generate all of these objects very easily. In particular, what we're not going to do is we're not going to use an off-the-shelf functional form like Klino-Willis. And there's a good reason for that, because the off-the-shelf functional forms are unable to capture these sufficient statistics in a reasonable way. And I'm going to clarify that in a second. So here's the data. These are the estimates by Amiti et al. We just put a spline through them to make them like, to turn them into functions. Okay, so we fit a spline to their point estimates. So on the left, we have the pass-through function. And you could see that for the smallest firm, the pass-through starts at about 1. So they look very CES-y. And then as you get bigger and bigger, when you get to the largest firm in the economy, the pass-through has gone all the way down to like 0.25 or 0.3 or something like this. It's very, very low. And here is the sales distribution in logs. So you see, as you're moving across the percentiles of the firm size distribution, this is a linear equation in logs. That means it has an exponential tail. Then when you get into the really big firms, it becomes exponential in logs. So it becomes super exponential tails when you get to the very biggest firms. Okay, and so these are these hefty, chunky guys who have the really low pass-throughs. So what we're going to do, and I'm not going to talk about this too much because it's a technique we're borrowing from another paper, is we're going to recover the Kimball parameter, the Kimball aggregator by solving a differential equation. We basically treat this thing as a differential equation in the cross-section of firms, and we solve it, and we get what the Kimball aggregator has to be up to a boundary condition. And the boundary condition is going to be the average markup. So for our exercises, I'm going to set the average markup to 15%. And then that gives me what the markup function looks like. That's consistent with the Amiti et al.'s pass-through estimates. The other parameters I'm going to set is I'm going to set the Calvo parameter to be 1/2 which means that a period is roughly about a quarter to half a year. And I'm going to set the Frisch elasticity to 0.2, which is sort of reasonable, I think, given the micro estimates. By the way, here is the estimated markup distribution that we get for this model. And so here we're plotting the implied markups against the log size of the firm. What you see is that the vast majority of firms have a markup that's pretty close to 1. And then when we get to the really big guys, the markup starts shooting up and it goes as much as 2.75. Okay, so we're able, another way to say it, we match this function exactly. We match this function exactly, and this is the implied markup distribution. If you were to take these functions and try to fit like a Kleno-Willis to try to replicate this, you're gonna start getting really weird stuff. So for example, in order to match the pass-throughs, a Kleno-Willis model would have to have the highest firms charge a markup that's about 200. Whereas here, the maximum markup is like 2.5. So you're gonna need like 200,000% markups or something in order to be able to match this shape of the pass-through function with an off-the-shelf functional form. Which is to say, another way to say it is a standard calibration of Kleno-Willis doesn't give you big productivity effects, even if you put firm heterogeneity in it. Why? Because the standard calibration of Kleno-Willis completely botches this picture. And if getting this picture right is correct, you need pass-throughs to change in the cross-section. And in Kleno-Willis, you get that pass-throughs are not equal to 1, but they just don't change in the cross-section very much. They go from like 0.68 to 0.64 as you move in the cross-section. And you need more covariance in order to get something reasonable. Okay, so very good. So here's what the static model looks like if we calibrate it, and we have the slope of the Phillips curve, okay?
David, very quickly on the last slide.
Yes.
So what are the magnitudes in the y-axis?
This one.
2 means, for instance?
2 means like a markup of, so 1 means no markup. That means price equals marginal cost. 2 means your markup is like 100%. So if you think of like the Deloker kind of estimates for really big firms, they are in the range of about 200% markups, okay? What Kleno-Willis would do is 20,000% markups if you wanted to match this picture, okay? So this isn't too crazy, I think is another way to say it. Okay, good. So here what we're doing is we're just plotting the wage Phillips curve and the CPI Phillips curve in the static model. So in the benchmark static model, the wage Phillips curve has a slope of 5, the CPI Phillips curve has a slope of 2, and then we can see what the contribution of the different mechanisms are in the model, right? So like if I go back, I'm sorry to be flipping through slides, if I go through these Phillips curve expressions, I can turn on and off different parts of it to see how much it matters, right? So it's a decomposition of the effect inside the same model. And what you can see is that if you only had sticky price mechanism, the Phillips curve would be something like, 12 or 6, depending on what you're looking at. And then if you have the real rigidities mechanism operating, this is what the literature has been emphasizing, this is strategic complementarities, the Phillips curve becomes flatter. But when you put in the misallocation channel, it's about as powerful in terms of flattening the Phillips curves as real rigidities are, okay? Here is how the slope of the Phillips curve varies as we change the Frisch, okay? And the different sort of channels. So the sticky price channel on its own, which is the green line, you can see that the Phillips curve becomes flatter as you make labor supply more and more elastic, which is intuitive, right? What you see is when you incorporate real rigidities, you make the Phillips curve flatter. So the slope gets lower at every value of the Frisch. And so this is what the literature has been emphasizing. The other thing you see is when you include the misallocation channel, the slope becomes flatter still. And this misallocation channel is most powerful when the Frisch is small, which is the range that the empirical estimates tell us we should be focused on. So empirical estimates of the Frisch elasticity of labor supply put it roughly at around 0.2. What's sort of interesting in this picture is these two pictures, these two lines, the green and the orange, they shoot off to infinity as the Frisch goes to 0. Because in a model with no, with inelastic labor supply, the Phillips curve would normally be vertical. But that doesn't happen in the blue line. The blue line hits the axis at a finite number. Why? Because when you have the misallocation channel, monetary policy can affect output even if there's no change in employment, just through the productivity effects alone. And so that's why this is so much lower. Great. And so this is a comparison of, like, instead of decomposing the effect inside the same model, we can take different models and just recalibrate to see what we get. And you have very similar stuff. You know, the CS model, very steep Phillips curve. The homogeneous Kimball model, which is the one that only has the real rigidities, makes the Phillips curve flatter, and then the benchmark model makes the Phillips curve flatter still. We can also do non-linear stuff in the static model. So before I go to the dynamic model, I want to very briefly show you what happens if we do non-linear shocks in the static model. So because the static model, we have the whole structure of the Kimball aggregator. We can just solve it to see what happens if the shocks are bigger, okay? And so here is what happens with the really big shocks. So again, what we have here is the green is sort of the traditional model. The yellow is the model with real rigidities and no heterogeneity. And the blue is the model with heterogeneity, real rigidities, and price stickiness. So here is what you can see is that the benchmark model is actually like really non-linear, okay? So for small enough monetary shocks, you can see that monetary policy, sort of the slope of this is greater than the other lines at the 0 inflation point. So this is saying that monetary policy is more powerful. It can reduce output and it can raise output by more. But if you keep pushing it, if you keep doing this monetary impulse, at some point, instead of improving TFP, you're going to start to make TFP worse, because like the inflation you're causing is bringing in price dispersion, like the usual price dispersion that monetary policy, that inflation is bad for. And once you start doing that, then then TFP is going to start to fall. And so the TFP is falling at a rate that's roughly commensurate with increases in employment. And so you get like basically an inability to stimulate the economy because the employment effects and the TFP effects are fighting each other. And on the flip side, monetary policy can do a lot of damage if it wants to, because it can both reduce employment and make TFP worse at the same time. Okay, so you sort of have a Murphy's law of central banking here, which is like you can't stimulate a ton, but you can do a lot of damage if you wanted to. The one thing, though, I would caution you about taking these pictures really seriously, because I think Calvo it's sort of a fiction, you know, that only works when the shocks are small. And so for really gigantic shocks, you probably shouldn't be using a Calvo model in the first place. And so I think one interesting extension or sort of additional feature that we would like to explore in the future is for large shocks. Once we move away from Calvo, what are the implications? If you started to do like Rodenberg or menu cost or something like that. You can also do what is the optimal amount of inflation in the static model, like a one-shot thing. Like that's very easy. And what you see is that utility would be maximized with a little bit of inflation. But it's not in the standard model. There's no inflationary impulse whatsoever. In this model, there's a bit of inflationary impulse because it helps with these misallocation effects, but not that much. You know, it's a pretty small effect. Here are the Yep, Ernesto.
Very quick. You have 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So here is the dynamic model, just the log linearis dynamic model. Here we're doing impulse responses for a money growth shock. So I could do it with interest rate shocks, but sometimes people find the money growth shocks more intuitive. So here's how the economy responds. So again, the green is Baqaae chapter 3. The orange is Baqaae chapter 3 plus real rigidity. So you have a homogeneous Kimball aggregator, but no heterogeneity in the firm distribution. The blue is the model is the benchmark model that has the heterogeneity in the firm size distribution. So what do you see here? So what you see is, in terms of how output responds to an increase in money supply, you can see that real rigidities amplify the effects, and then the misallocation channel amplifies the effects further. The other thing that you see is the misallocation effect actually makes the effects quite a bit more persistent relative to the traditional model. Okay, and so this is something we're going to come back to in a second. The other thing that you can see is that aggregate TFP in the benchmark model is pro-cyclical, like it is in the data, whereas in the standard model, it would just be a flat line. So the orange and the green are on top of each other. Similarly, TFPR dispersion, like if you look at dispersion in TFPR within firms over time, is counter-cyclical. It's like the reverse image of the solo residual. And again, this is something that people have observed in the data, but in the standard model, it's a flat line. It's just not changing. Okay. So here we plot the two figures again. So here's the output response. It's just I've copied this picture again, but made it bigger. And on the right panel, what we're doing is we're plotting the ratio of the orange to the green and the ratio of the blue to the orange. And what you can see is that on impact, they both are raising the effectiveness of monetary policy by something like 20% or something like this. Like, you know, this number looks small, but it's because of the axis. Like these are like about 1.3, 1.5, that's sort of where they start. And then what you see is that as you extend the horizon, they become more and more powerful. And so the misallocation effect, compared to the baseline models, once you're like a few quarters out, or like you're like 2 years out or something like that, which would be around here, like the misallocation effects and the real rigidities effects are making the shock much more persistent. So here's how the half-life changes. So in the traditional model, the half-life of a monetary impulse is about 3 periods. In the model with real rigidities, instead of 3, it's almost 4. In the model with misallocation channel, instead of 4, it's almost 5. Another way you can sort of measure monetary non-neutrality in this model is to use the Alvarez and Lippi et al. Kind of statistic. So they say one sort of universal way that you should measure non-neutrality of money is to basically integrate under the impulse response curve for output. So you just sort of just add up the net present value of the effect of the monetary impulse. And so in the CES model, it's 0.33. It's basically has another, like it's almost doubled as you go when you add real rigidities, and it's sort of increased again by the same amount when you add the misallocation channel. And so this mechanism is conceivably, you know, quite powerful if you put it in the model. It's not like if you think real rigidities matters, which a lot of people think that it does, then these effects are sort of roughly as powerful as those effects. Okay, great. So I've got like a few minutes left. So I'm just going to summarize some extensions that we have in the paper that I didn't get a chance to talk about too much. One is something that Francesco asked about, which is how does changes in the firm size distribution affect the slope of monetary, the slope of the Phillips curve? And so the answer is it does, and we do some basic exercises to see how much it does that. And so if you sort of take the firm size distribution, like the aggregate firm size distribution in the retail sector for the US, and you look at how the concentration in that industry has changed from 1978 to today, and you match that in the model, you make the Phillips curve flatter by about 25%. So it does result in a flattening of the Phillips curve, but the change is not like, you know, it's not, it's sizable, but it's not humongous, you know? So, so I wouldn't, so my prior would be that while these effects are probably there in the data, if you're looking for an explanation of why the Phillips curve has become much flatter over time, I don't think this is the only explanation. I think that you probably need some other explanations as well. Probably, like, for example, inflation expectations getting more anchored is very important. The other thing we do in the paper that I didn't have a chance to talk about is we show how to combine this mechanism with a more quantitative model. So, for example, how to do multiple sectors, how to do multiple factors, how to do input-output linkages, which are very important in the way that they affect monetary policy transmission. So you can marry this model with all of those ingredients relatively easily, and you can also put in sticky wages relatively easily. And sort of the punchline is like, in the paper we show you how to do it, but they don't seem to, at least if you use industry level data, they don't seem to interact very much. So like, you know, you have the traditional input-output linkage story, which is you make monetary policy more powerful. And then you have this story, which is it makes monetary policy more powerful. And so you put them together, monetary policy is even more powerful. And then the final thing we do in the paper is we do an Atkinson-Bernstein calibration instead of doing Kimball. And when you do Atkinson-Bernstein, as long as you know you match these statistics, like these statistics with Atkinson-Bernstein, you get very similar quantitative responses. The nice thing about monopolistic competition over Atkinson-Bernstein is the dynamic model with monopolistic competition is much easier than a dynamic model with Atkinson-Bernstein. Because when you have a dynamic Atkinson-Bernstein model, you effectively have a dynamic game that you have to solve. And those strategic interactions become very difficult. And the nice thing about monopolistic competition is it gives you a kosher way to sort of ignore those strategic interactions. Okay, very good. So I'm going to wrap up now. So here are sort of the big picture things I would like you to have taken away from all this talking I've done. The first thing is that when you have initial distortions, then there's a sort of a good case that monetary policy can potentially affect allocative efficiency to a first order, okay? And we all sort of understand that the economy is distorted in the initial equilibrium before the monetary shock arrives. The second thing is if there's a systematic reallocation that happens when you get a monetary easing, then these effects can be very powerful. So for example, if realized pass-through co-varies with the initial level of the markup wedge, then monetary policy can affect output quite strongly. And what this is going to result in is a flattening of the Phillips curve, an increase in the persistence, and an imparting of hump-shaped responses sort of for natural reasons. And then the thing we're working on now is trying to sort of take this kind of analysis to other kinds of demand shocks. So I think, you know, there's sort of nothing special about monetary policy per se. You could think about fiscal policy, you could think about exchange rate shocks. They probably could have similar effects. And also to try to understand what all of this implies for the conduct of optimal policy, which is something that we haven't touched in this paper, but we would like to be able to understand better. Okay, and that's all I have. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, David. So if you want to ask a question, please just unmute yourself and ask. And if you are in the as an attendee, please tell us your interest to speak in the chat and or in the Q&A, and we will open the mic for you. So in the meantime, yeah, I'd like to ask a question myself. It's about this last bullet. As you said, the story has nothing to do specifically with monetary policy, but it's of course is related to monetary economy because of the rigidities. So I wonder, I think it would be very informative if you could show us how different the model will react to a standard cost push shock and relative to the Baqaae standard model. Exactly to think about optimal monetary policy and stuff like that, but in a complete plain vanilla environment.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. So what we don't have here are like exogenous markup shocks or something like that, right? Which as a conceptual matter, I think it would be interesting to study for a variety of reasons, right? So one is like, you know, how does exogenous noise in markups that has nothing to do with size affect, let's say, how you map the model to data, right? So like that's one thing we know is that the markup distribution is quite dispersed in ways that aren't just explained by firm size. And so if you have that, that's going to sort of potentially affect you at every step of the way. It's going to affect you in terms of how you map the model to the data. It's going to affect you in terms of maybe the implied positive predictions of the model, right? Which is to say, like, how does output respond? And then it's also going to affect you when you want to think about things like optimal policy, normative questions, especially if that noise thing is moving around, right? And so we're working on trying to understand what happens if you have sort of noise in the markup distribution, at least from a positive angle. How does it affect inference? How does it affect the predictions of the model? One thing is, like, you know, these equations, they depend on the covariance, right? So if you had some random noise in there that's orthogonal to everything else, it doesn't affect the covariance at all. It just sort of drops out of the covariance and you don't have to worry about it whatsoever. So at least in that sense, I think the sort of intuitions I've given you are going to survive. The optimal policy question, I think, might be another paper, because I think we're just going to have to bring in more machinery to really try to study and understand that problem. The main thing is because we'll have to do like a second order approximation around a distorted steady state, because the model is going to have a distorted steady state. And that's a big job. So hopefully, you know, in the future, we're going to have a better answer for you.
Related to that, is there a divine coincidence here? Does it hold?
There is, yeah, there is, because we don't have cost push shocks, right? So in this model, if you stabilize, I mean, okay, I should be careful here, because I don't know. So here's the statement I know, which is, suppose that you said you had an exogenous objective function for the policymaker. You just said the policymaker wants to stabilize output and inflation. It wants to stabilize inflation around 0. It wants to stabilize output around the deterministic steady state. Then there is a divine coincidence in the sense that you can accomplish that, right? Because the demand shocks are causing everything. They're causing the TFP movements. They're causing the price dispersion. So just if you get rid of them, then you can stabilize both things. There's a different thing, right? Which is that, but maybe you don't want to stabilize output around its deterministic steady state, right? Because the level of output is distorted, and so you're underproducing, right? The markups are suppressing labor, so you have underemployment relative to first best, and there's these distortions, so you have like inefficiencies relative to first best in the cross-sectional distribution too. And so maybe this again is going to tie to what the optimal policy would look like in this model. Maybe you have an incentive to do something that's not just stabilize output and inflation.
Okay, the question is my understanding of the divine coincidence is that if there are aggregate productivity shocks and the central bank engineer 0 inflation, then the allocation is identical to the one of the flex prices.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I ask.
Yeah. So in this model, if the demand, at least if the supply shocks are aggregate supply shocks, then yes, then the central bank can implement the flex price outcome, which may not be the efficient thing to do. But what I actually don't know offhand is if you have heterogeneous productivity shocks. So if you have heterogeneous productivity shocks, maybe even in that case, actually, you can. I think there is divine coincidence. I think you can, if you have heterogeneous productivity shocks, I think what the central bank can still do is, actually, you know what? I take that back. Give me like a few minutes to think about it, and then I can answer you in our meeting. Because what I'm sure of is there's divine coincidence with aggregate productivity shocks, and then I have to think. I have to think about heterogeneous productivity shocks.
Okay. Anyone else want to ask a question? Okay, it seems that you answered all questions very clearly.
Okay, excellent. Great. Thank you
very much, David.